The tag for this video is FE username input. Now we're going to create the input box for the username. So we'll put it above the register element. We're going to use props. So we have a macro for that. Inline props. We'll make a public function username input, and that'll be the input box for the username. We're going to have a lifetime. We need to have the scope, state, and an onInput callback. And that's going to return an element. Now this function signature's got a lot going on, so let's go over it. Let's start with props. Each element we create has optional property values that we can include with the element. Normally, these are stored within a structure, and then that structure gets associated with the scope. But there are many times when an element only needs a few properties. That's where this inline props macro comes in. This macro is going to look at these function parameters, generate a new structure, and associate that structure with our scope for us automatically. This reduces the amount of code we need to write for smaller elements like this username input element. The inline props macro is great when we only have a few props, but in situations where there are many properties, it's better to make the prop structure manually, and we'll be doing that later in the project. Next is the state, and you'll see that the type of our state is the same thing that we have in our page state. So if we scroll up, we'll see that we have use state here at the top. So we have username, use state, and then we have the same thing here, use state. So this username input is going to be accessing this username here that exists in the page state by indirectly accessing use state. So this is the same use state right here, and that's going to go right up here, and it's going to be accessing the same thing. So it can go back and forth either way. Next up, we have onInput, which is an event handler. The event handler handles events emitted by the web browser. We're specifically looking at form events, which will have the data needed to read the information from the input box that exists on the web page. Finally, we have all these lifetime annotations. The lifetime annotations are needed because the event handler needs a lifetime. So this event handler here, it requires having a lifetime, and that lifetime needs to be associated with the scope. And since we're using lifetimes, we just have to put them on most of the things in this function signature. Technically, we don't need to have one on the element. However, it's just good practice because if we were to include another parameter that's borrowed, then we would get compiler errors without having this tick A right here. The majority of the elements within our application actually won't be borrowed. They'll be owned props, so we won't need to have lifetime annotations on the majority of the code. However, this specific case just has to have them because of the event handler. Now that we have our function signature, we're going to write the code to generate the element. So we're going to start with our cx.render, then use our rsx macro. Then we're going to create a div, and we're going to make a flex column. We'll take a quick look at the design document. So if we zoom in here to the registration page, we'll see that the username label right here, that's above the input box. So if we make a flex column, we can just easily stack them on top of each other. So we're going to create the label now. And we have to use a raw identifier again because we have for, which is an HTML attribute, but it's also a keyword in Rust. So we have to use the r hash. It's going to be for username. And we'll just call the label username. Then we're going to create an input. We're going to have an ID username. The name attribute will also be username. The class will be input-field, and that's going to be another Tailwind class that we create. We'll have a placeholder. Username. And then we'll have onInput. We're going to create a closure. And we're going to do onInput.call with the event. So with this onInput handler, we're creating a new closure with our form event here. So this EV is going to have the form event type that's up there. And we're taking our onInput event handler that we passed into this element. That's down here, and we're going to call it. And we're going to call it with the form event. And then we'll be able to read data out of that event with some other code that we're going to be writing shortly. Let's go back to our Tailwind file and create the input field class. For input fields, we're going to have, it's going to be an @apply. And we're going to have width full, border 2, rounded, border slate 400. That's all we need for that. Now that we've finished creating our username input, we'll be able to use it within our registration page, which we'll be doing in the next video.